we're ready to go. So welcome back. We're starting off with freedom camping for our first workshop. I'll hand it over to Kieran.
Thank you.
Do you want questions going through or at the end?
Going through is
Going
fine.
through? Thank you.
Morena, everyone. So we're here talking about freedom camping in Porirua. In front of you is an A3 that was also attached to the agenda, and this covers the current state of freedom camping in Porirua, issues we have around enforcement, and concerns of Ngāti Toa, and the options we have going forward. I have a short presentation going through that, but I'm also happy to just take that all as read if we prefer.
Thank you. Yes.
Go through it.
Go through quickly. We've read it, obviously, but you just pull up the main points.
Can do.
Yes, Mike.
What options do people have around the city other than the Plimmerton-based camping ground and the one up at Elsdon? Are there any other options around for them to camp?
For camping,
Yeah.
those are the only campsites there is.
The Plimmerton one, you have to be a member,
Yes, that's a member.
of that association. Yeah.
In terms of freedom camping sites, we have the 4 sites there. Ngāti Toa Domain is obviously the largest one. Motu Karaka Point, Brady's Bay, and Onipoto Esplanade Reserve all have a max of 3 vehicles at a time. Current usage, so whilst paid parking was on hold, our parking and enforcement team undertook regular reviews of all our current sites and recorded down how many campers were there. Ngāti Toa Domain is obviously the most popular one, averaging nearly 12, but there is a seasonal element to it. Over summer, it is considerably more popular. That's also true of Motu Karaka Point. It averages 2.3, but over summer, it was noted that there were regularly more than 3 vehicles there, despite the fact that the rules state there is a 3-vehicle limit.
Not just in summer there, in winter
Yes,
as well.
that's
That is actually a very popular place.
Yes. So the current challenges we have, despite Ngāti Toa Domain being by far the most used site, most of the complaints you receive are from Motu Karaka Point. The complaints are typically around people staying longer than the 3-night limit, but there's also some complaints about people parking in the wrong place, not parking in that designated area, and the excessive number of campers. At Ngāti Toa Domain, the typical complaint we get is that people are just not in the marked areas. They're camping somewhere else. But we do have the occasional complaints about overstaying and some around behaviour. That's typically rubbish left. There's also some around campers with dogs not being on lead, but it's a relatively small number of complaints.
Jeff.
Can I just get a clarity with regards to disposal of waste? Have there been issues raised or complaints raised in regards to our existing sites with that? And does it appear, if it doesn't appear on here, is that because it's just of such a significantly low number?
Waste in terms of rubbish or the human? Yes. No, there's very little complaint about that. The parks team, I think, have noted in the past the occasional issue with it, but it's not something that showed up in the complaints. I think it's a very niche issue that pops up occasionally.
Mike.
So are there facilities for them to get rid of grey water and that at these places?
The only public one, not at the sites, the only public one in Porirua is at the BP along Mana Esplanade.
But there is one at the Plimmerton site for those users,
So,
if you remember.
Yeah, the Motorhome Association. So in terms of enforcement, our current rules are made through the Reserves Management Plan and then reflected in our Reserves Bylaw and Public Places Bylaw. So on reserves, those rules are made under the Reserves Act, and that Act has recently had changes made, giving councils the power to issue infringements for people breaking bylaws. The issue outside of reserves is that the only powers we have are under the LGA at the moment, and the LGA doesn't have any ability to issue on-the-spot fines. Our only tool for enforcement is prosecution for breaking the rules, and that is time-consuming, costly, and often an excessive response to the issues that freedom camping presents. This is particularly an issue at Motukaraka Point, which mostly sits on road, not reserve land. So we get a lot of complaints from there. The enforcement team has limited powers to actually enforce the rules. They typically just try and talk to the campers, encourage them to follow the rules, but there is a perception this creates that council's not listening to the complaints and that we're not enforcing our rules. We reached out to Ngāti Toa to understand their concerns around freedom camping, and their broad concern is that they don't see freedom camping as appropriate on sites of significance to them. And this covers 3 of our current freedom camping sites, Ngāti Toa Domain, Motukaraka Point, and Onipoto Esplanade Reserve. In further discussion, while they can't support freedom camping at Ngāti Toa Domain, they do accept that it's perhaps not realistic to expect it to be banned there given the size and popularity of camping there.
Can I ask you, did you give them a map with Brady's Bay? Because that's sitting exactly the same as the other ones on the harbour.
Yes, so we gave them a bigger document, so it actually covered a number of sites in the city, and they came back to us with the ones that they had an issue with, and it was Motukaraka Point was one in particular of significance. Brady's Bay they didn't raise.
Okay. Mike?
Just want to acknowledge Ngāti Toa's stance on that with the ban, saying that it's not a practical thing. I think that's pretty damn good of them.
So going forward, there's 4 options for council. The first one would be just maintain the status quo, and that would be we manage freedom camping on reserves under the Reserves Act, all other land under the Local Government Act. The advantage of this approach is that it's the status quo, so there's no change needed, but we would still have the power to make changes to our rules or sites if we desired, and we'd have to consult on those. Council maintains full control under the LGA and Reserves Act of where we would allow freedom camping and the rules. The downside of the status quo, as I've explained, is that outside of reserve land, there is very little enforcement tools available for officers to ensure the rules are being followed. And the status quo also doesn't address any of the current issues with freedom camping, particularly at Motukaraka Point. As I was mentioned in the paper, we did receive some funding from central government to help develop a bylaw. And if we were to maintain the status quo, we would likely have to return this funding. The other option would be a full ban on freedom camping across the city. This is the approach that other councils have taken, including the 2 in the Hutt Valley. The only way to do this would be under the Reserves Act. We can ban freedom camping on reserves. That's quite simple. Outside of reserves, the only act available is the Local Government Act. Parking rules can't be used to target freedom camping. We could, for instance, introduce a ban saying you can't park in this car park overnight, but that would have to apply to everyone. We couldn't say that just applies to campers. That's the limitations of the transport bylaw. The Freedom Camping Act, which I'll discuss shortly, also can't be used to ban camping entirely. It explicitly states that you have to allow some level of freedom camping under the Freedom Camping Act. So that just leaves the LGA, which, as I've explained, has minimal enforcement tools to enforce a ban. Most campers tend to follow the rules, so if we did have a citywide ban, most campers would follow that. The issue would be if people choose to camp anyway, and particularly choose to camp on non-reserve land, we would have very limited tools to actually address that.
So can I ask a quick? We don't have the enforcement, obviously, to go out at night because we don't have staff who are working. But then other councils who've done this, what's happening to the people who are living in cars? Because this is a real thing, and I know there's a number that go to Brady Bay at night. Where would they go if we did that? It just seems over the top.
So there is a distinction, I think, between freedom campers and people that are homeless living in their cars. The Freedom Camping Act specifically says that if you're homeless, you're not freedom camping, and the rules cannot be used against homeless people. The LGA and Reserves Act doesn't have those provisions, but in practice, council's approach to dealing with homeless people would be different to our approach to dealing with freedom campers. So
So they could still go to these reserves and it really wouldn't make a huge amount of difference because there's no compliance after night anyway. Is that what you're saying, roughly?
Well, I guess the point would be that when we have people sleeping in their cars, it wouldn't be freedom camping rules that we'd be using to try and address that issue. It would be most likely coming from the homeless outreach side.
Jeff?
We would enforce, if you decided to do this, we would have to find a strategy to enforce this. So normally our enforcement staff don't work after hours, but we would have to rethink that, there's some consequences. And as I understand it, because I think you've told me this before, the Hutt Valley does have commercial camping sites that, so they are basically annexing camping to those. We don't we have one, do we?
Okay. Jeff?
Can I just add through you, and can I just add, we will enforce for specific issues. So we will go out after hours, whatever hours are needed, depending on what's flaring up. So we can do that at the moment. And like Wendy said, this will change our enforcement program, which the staff are up for doing. We've just got to balance their needs.
Okay. Jeff?
It's related to the line of questioning around homelessness, and I'll give reflections later on, but just want to ask questions around this. While it is not our responsibility to second guess the role of those who are dealing with it on an operational level, can you give some commentary as to how someone on the ground makes a distinction between a freedom camper and someone who is living rough or is homeless at a site? What is the distinction here? How does that get determined?
There is a large grey area in there between someone that is freedom camping and homeless. I think in the first instance, under the new self-contained rules, the self-contained vehicles would be a start, a good indicator. And there's also be people that I think are quite clearly not freedom camping. But in terms of enforcing the rules, I think there would have to be a cautious approach around where we aren't certain whether someone is genuinely freedom camping or homeless, and side on not enforcing through fines where we think there may be some doubt there.
Typically, if we do have alerts about homeless people, whether they're in a car or any other way, we do send out different staff. So sometimes our enforcement staff are the people who might alert us, but it's then Ruben's team who will go out and try and engage people and connect them into social services. So it's a much softer approach, obviously, and that's not always successful, but that's the approach. It's very difficult, homelessness in public places. Councils across the country wrestle with those issues, and as do we. We don't have as much as, for example, our neighbours to the south, but it's a problem, that this would not solve, and we wouldn't seek to solve, homelessness in a public place through this mechanism. This is actually just trying to manage the typically a lot of our, not exclusively, but a lot of our people are either getting ready to get on a ferry or coming off a ferry and want, just hunkering down for the night before travelling off. There's a wee bit of Motukaraka Point, for example. I gather people come from the Hutt Valley and have a few nights at Motukaraka Point. So there's a bit of variety in there, but and you've got to remember we've also got Kapiti to the north who have a lot more issues around freedom camping for the same reasons, the ferry drop off and pick up.
Yeah, I'd just add it's a bespoke approach. So sometimes it's gone through the dog control team, sometimes it's come through the parking team, sometimes it comes through Rubens, and it's a multi-pronged approach depending on where they are, who they've got with them, and what acts can be used. So it's very bespoke when it comes to the homelessness issue.
Yep, Jeff.
A couple of subs, and notwithstanding that, I'll leave commentary and on reflections at the end. Are officers satisfied with regards to making those types of decisions and having to live in that, unavoidable grey area, that irrespective of the part of the team of the council, whether it's whatever unit, are consistent in their awareness and implementation? I wouldn't want it to be, seen that one group of staff are being far more harsher in dealing with interpreting this. I think in terms of process, we should be consistent on this. So, can you give some commentary around that?
We team up. So when we get a report of a homeless situation, we will team up with Ruben's team, the partnerships team. We'll assess all that's going on, get all the intel we can, and then make a considered decision, and including thinking how have we dealt with cases similar in the past, and what precedents are we setting for the future. So it's very much a team-up approach between the two, with a people first consideration. We start there.
I know we actually want to talk about freedom camping, so I'm going to just not have any more. I don't have any more questions on homelessness at the moment. But since I've got the chance to ask these questions, rating impact, if we take the option 1 or 2, is what, 1% of rates, because it's it's OPEX, if I recall correctly. Is that correct?
In terms of,
what's the rating impact to cover the imbalance when we pay back the government because we chose either options 1 or 2?
I'm not sure the exact how it works out as rating. It's about just over $100,000.
Can officers provide?
I'll answer that question. Through the chair, it's OPEX, so it'll come back into our income statement as an expense if we had to write it off.
Oh, I see. But there still would be, notwithstanding the over-unders of the council, someone has to pay for that, and the ratepayers may choose to be one of those. What does that mean in terms of a rating impact if it was that pathway as opposed to debt or covering from already eating from inside?
So how much was it?
100,000.
So 100,000. So basically
0.1.
It's 0.1%.
Sorry, I had my decimal right. Incorrect. Sorry, apologies. And the other one is, as a percentage of noting that this is freedom camping is a regional challenge, how many freedom camping sites do we currently operate as a percentage of those sites within 50 kilometres of the ferry terminals? Because that's normally, as has been alluded to before, the main purpose, while there would be sites within travelling distance to then travel across to the other side of the island or vice versa.
I'm not sure of the exact number. Kapiti has more. Wellington only has a couple. The Hut doesn't have any, so not as much as Kapiti, but a decent amount.
I guess when we get to the actual process of reviewing this formally, that might be a question that I think would be good to have in terms of the broader context of what our slice of the challenge is from a regional perspective.
Yeah, we'll bring you regional numbers to give you the context.
Cool. No more questions.
Kylie?
Thank you. When reading this, I saw obviously freedom camping, you associate it with just vehicles only. But how many of these sites are used for tenting? So tents put up, because there's no information in this.
So the current rules don't allow camping at any of our sites. It pops up very occasionally, but it's not permitted, and generally the vast majority of campers are in vehicles.
Okay, so if somebody wanted to put up a tent in Porirua City, where would they go?
They'd have to go to one of the campsites, Battle Hill.
Which is not run by us, it's run by Great
don't
Wellington.
have-
So in Porirua City, if people wanted to, take a classroom overnight camping that's not Battle Hill, then where would they go in Porirua?
I think Camp Elsden may have some, but
So nowhere, really?
Not-
Right,
yeah.
okay.
Kathleen?
How long ago did the Hutt City and Upper Hutt implement those changes?
I don't believe they've ever allowed freedom camping. That's been their starting point, is that, they haven't allowed it. I'd have to double check that, but if it was ever changed, it wasn't recent, and they've never used the Freedom Camping Act to have freedom camping rules. So I believe that's their long-term position, has been not allowing freedom camping.
Oh, okay. Has there been any kind of like lessons or anything that you could have we can take from them doing that?
From the discussions I've had with them, I don't have any data, but they don't have a lot of issues. Campers generally not allowed to camp there. They generally don't camp there. They go to places that they know they're allowed to camp. But when it does come up, they do have issues around actually enforcing it. I think if we were to go down that path, we would probably have issues to start with. I imagine there may be some teething issues and campers getting used to not being able to camp in Porirua. Longer term, it would probably be similar to the hut where it doesn't happen much, but it does happen occasionally where people choose to camp anyway.
Do you have data on are these international tourists that are freedom camping? Are they Kiwis on domestic holiday or?
We've set up a survey where it's on our website at the moment where campers can go in when they go to our freedom camping page. So we've started a survey and we're going to be going out over summer as well to try and get feedback from the campers. Anecdotally, it seems to mostly be locals, but with over summer, I think a high number of international.
When you say locals,
New Zealanders,
Kiwis.
as opposed to
I know
international
people that go
tourists.
from Whitby to Mochiraka Point to camp overnight for 2 nights. I've bumped into people around there. It's quite common. Yeah, very local. Mike, sorry, had you finished, Kathleen? Mike.
So I used to have a camper, and we were in Te Puke, the whole family, and we had nowhere to stay, so we parked in the railway station at Te Puke there overnight. And we got woken at 6 o'clock in the morning with the local market setting up there. So that was good fun. But my question is, what's to stop people from parking in the shopping area there just for the night and then moving to another park? There's nothing to stop people parking in those, is there?
At the moment, that would be against our freedom camping rules, but because it's non-reserve land, it'll be LGA, and our only powers would be to, ask them to leave or prosecute. But parking rules still apply, so if they were there when paid parking began, then they would have to pay for it, and the time limits would also apply. But outside of those designated times, it's only the LGA that could be enforced. All right, so the other options we have is introducing standalone freedom camping bylaws. The first option for this is that we just use the Freedom Camping Act. This act would apply on all council land, no distinction between reserve land and non-reserve land. And if we and NZTA agreed, we could also include NZTA land in there.
I just asked him, and I was
Ross,
waiting for this. So the a Freedom Camping Act can trump the Reserves Act.
It has a provision in there which says you can use any other act to enforce freedom camping. So what we would do is we would pull the rules out of the reserves bylaw and management plan and just say, okay, now this is managed by the freedom camping bylaw. So it doesn't explicitly trump it, but you need to make sure there's no inconsistency. We couldn't say under the Freedom Camping Act we allow or don't allow on reserves, and then also have different rules in the reserves management plan. They'd have to be consistent, but yes, you can manage reserves under the Freedom Camping Act.
Okay. Well, you're probably going to explain it, but I wanted to understand the permit by default approach.
Yes.
And us having to expand. Why do we have to expand the number of
Yes.
sites because of this?
So the Freedom Camping Act, it's quite different to other acts in that the approach to freedom camping is that it says you must allow freedom camping everywhere. And then there are specific reasons why you may decide to not allow it at specific places. And those reasons are in order to protect the area, to protect access to the area, or for health and safety reasons. And so what that means is that you don't start with, okay, let's find sites where we think freedom camping is appropriate. You start with everywhere, and then you rule out sites based on those criteria. And so what that means is that we've done that review of all potential camping sites in Porirua, and there is, I think, 13 sites, including 2 NZTA ones, where there is no good reason under the Act to not allow freedom camping there. The caveat would be Motu Karaka Point, where we could argue that in order to protect the site as a site of significance to Ngāti Toa, we need to prohibit freedom camping there. In order to do that, we'd need to do more work with Ngāti Toa to understand their concerns more specifically and make a case that freedom camping would never be appropriate here. But even if we were all to take that one out and Onepoto Esplanade Reserve for the same reason, there'd still be several more sites that we would have to introduce just because we can't have a justification for not allowing freedom camping there.
Begs the question then, so what work would we have to do to allow freedom camping at the other sites that are not already designated?
Yeah, so we would use the funding we received to upgrade the sites physically, make sure there's adequate signage, mark the spaces if needed, basically make it very clear where you can park at the specific site, which then makes enforcement easier for the officers.
So does that mean places like Adventure Park, where we've had people try and freedom camp, but we have a barrier that goes down, we would have to look at something like that to rule it out?
So yes, we've done that already in Adventure Park. We ruled out for the reasons of historic antisocial behaviour at night that it wouldn't be appropriate. But there are a number of other sites where we did not have that justification for not allowing it.
Okay, Kylie?
Thank you. So the most of the complaints at Motu Karaka Point is about overstaying, and I'm assuming that it is the residents that live in that area that are the most complainers, and not particularly Ngāti Toa.
Yeah, so the residents there, well, at least some of them are generally quite aware of what the rules are, and they're quick to tell council when they notice someone not following them.
Okay. I just noticed that the main issue is overstaying and not anything else. Okay, thank you.
Jeff?
So I'm going to talk about option 4 and 3 because in regards to this point, which is based on your response that if we go down either 3 or 4, there is going to be a recognition of additional sites that we currently do not provide under status quo, and that a cost will be borne to make good those sites in accordance with these new bylaws, if passed. So how much do we have available already from the funds that would go towards that, and has analysis been done if there is a shortfall with that contribution, that the proposed fee structure and penalty structure would be enough to cover the costs of implementing this policy? I would be rather perturbed if this became an area where the ratepayer had to subsidise to meet this obligation.
Yep.
We haven't done the site-by-site analysis yet of exactly what's needed, but the discussions are being that the money we have should be sufficient for clearly marking the sites. And maybe worthwhile just discussing option 4 briefly, because the biggest distinction here is that we are continuing to manage reserves under the Reserves Act. And so what that would mean is that any of those potential sites that are on reserve land don't fall under that requirement of permit by default. And so under option 4, we would still have to introduce a few more sites, but significantly less than option 3, given a large number of the potential camping sites are reserve land, not roading. And so the Reserves Act then basically trumps the Freedom Camping Act, and we can just decide where and when we allow it.
Sorry, can I just add further to that? There will be an enforcement cost, and I guess the assessment we've got to do is whether there's how much cost recovery comes out of that enforcement. So if we can fine, will that be a bit like parking, in that we can offset the extra time it will take to go and enforce the bylaw, and how much will we cost recover on that, or will there be a gap that is attributable to the rate payer over and above? So we haven't done that calculation yet, but that will be what we'd have to bring to you when it comes to you making that decision.
Okay, I forgot my question, so I'll come back at some point.
Ross?
Yeah.
I was going to ask a similar question in terms of overall costs, but I mean, you'll be wet fingering that really, won't you? Because do we have any other examples around the country where we can have a, that's enough, where we can, I'm trying not to laugh, all right, where we can, Kylie, stop it, where we can get data that would enable us to have a reasonable guess about whether this is going to be cost neutral or whether it's not. I suspect it won't be, but...
Yeah, there are a number of councils that already have freedom camping bylaws, and so we can get some information around how much they collect. Obviously, the point of issuing infringements is to encourage good behaviour, and so it's up in the air of we can look
Not
at
to gather money.
We can look at our current complaints, but in theory, the number of infringements would decrease if we start issuing infringements. So
Yeah. One more question. So, how many fewer sites would there be if we were under the Reserves Act? You talked about a dozen or so extra. How many?
I believe there were three, I think, would be in the attachment, that were non-reserve land that we would, under option 4, still have to introduce. And then there were 2 NZTA ones, which would essentially be up to us, and NZTA if we want to include as well.
So an extra 3 over and above the existing 4.
Yes, but we could also take that opportunity to consider whether the existing 4 should remain as freedom camping sites as well.
So if we went to extra, do you have to consult on those? Because the people who live near these are not obviously going to be very impressed.
Yes, so we would have to consult on this using special consultative procedure. We would have to make clear in the consultation the criteria under which the Freedom Camping Act allows us to not allow freedom camping, because objections, just neighbours not wanting a freedom camping site doesn't satisfy the Act's requirements, so we'd have to encourage them to submit in terms of what the Act outlines.
Jeff?
I remember my part time now. It's an associate around the relative merits of option 3 and 4 as being presented, around the burden of administration. I understand that there's going to be a need to be consistent between these 2 elements with regards to this option 4. What does that mean in terms of staff, time or resources to make sure that's consistent? And what would that mean for freedom campers in terms of their ability, their user experience?
The issue around the border between reserve and non-reserve land is really just one in terms of setting up the rules and the sites. So in terms of administering, officers would need to be aware of, for each specific site, is this reserve site, is this non-reserve site, because they'll be using a different act to enforce, but there wouldn't be an ongoing burden of having that. We'd make sure that when we set our sites up that it's very clear that this camping is on reserve land or this camping is on non-reserve land.
Can I add, sorry, Jeff, can I add, right now, everything, all the time that the enforcement officers are spending on, say, Motor Karaka Point, of which there was a lot, is none of that. That's all on OPEX, direct OPEX costs to the ratepayer. It's not in any way cost recoverable. So we're already incurring a cost, so we will have to weigh that up when we're looking at the options and put that recipe to you with which to help you make that decision.
Thank you for that response. So if I've understood correctly, in terms of the establishment, there's not tremendously difference between Model 3 and Model 4 in terms of the additional work required by officers to get that done, but there are other elements to be considered here that have already been alluded to. Is that correct?
That is. There would probably be less time to set up option 4 because there would be fewer sites. Yeah.
Okay. No question.
Thank you. Anybody else got any questions?
So
Ross?
just confirming that we will get the information that Jeff has been talking about in terms of those cost comparisons between option 3 and option 4. I mean, I personally, I've written off 1 and 2. So for me, it's between option 3 and option 4. And we need to understand the balance of cost and ongoing costs, as well as set-up costs to help make that decision as well as some of the impacts of numbers of sites and those sorts of things.
We can looked at, they could provide some estimates, but it's very likely that option 3 would be more costly purely based on more sites to administer.
Okay,
Did you
thank
have,
you.
Jeff?
If I could take the opportunity, if there's no other questions, I'll just give my reflections and we'll
Yep,
go from
that's
there.
fine.
Thank you, officers, for bringing forward this work. I can understand that there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of trying to give us some direction of travel, and I'm also mindful that you're wanting to be transparent in terms of using money that has been accessed from central government pool. So thank you for that. I haven't made a decision yet on any of the options, and I'll wait to see the report, and then obviously we'll have an opportunity potentially from the public to also feed into, and I'm really keen to hear what their views will be about that. But some more general points I think just need to be reflected in how we communicate and how we approach this. First of all, with regards to homelessness, and with specific regard to the points made in 55 through to 58, I think it is, I guess, you should take this as a reflection that nothing that we do should be designed to make it harder for us to demonstrate manaakitanga to those who are living rough right now. So please be assured that that will need to continue to be at the forefront of a conversation that doesn't actually talk about homelessness. It's about freedom camping. But to the hokepa meheta, they're not going to see much of a distinction here. The other piece of reflection I have here as well is, having acknowledged the feedback from the Runanga with regards to their views around those wāhi tāpu that are currently sites, if we are moving to a model that is either 3 or 4, I think that there may be an opportunity here in terms of, and again, this is why it's important to look about it in the regional context in terms of the overall number of spaces that we currently and could potentially provide to the region, to look at those sites that Ngāti Toa do have some concern about, because while we may have an increase in sites, it may be not a significant number in the grand scheme of things, and is that really worthy of the price that we paid in terms of not being able to actually think about, hey, maybe we use these sites because we have to make an argument around the cultural sensitivity of those other locations. So those are my 2 main reflections from this. I'm hopeful for what comes forward in the formal process.
Thank you. Anybody else before we round up? No? Okay, thank you very much, Kieran.
Thank you.
We're now going to be moving to the naming policy. Jade and Mia, do you want questions going through or at the end?
Through is fine. Okay. All right. Kia ora koutou. Tuatahi ko te wiki nei he wiki o te reo Māori. Kia kaha te reo Māori. Ake, ake, ake. Just wanted to start off and acknowledge this week as Māori Language Week and practice my te reo wherever I can.
Well done.
So we have provided quite a lot of background reading on the history of names in Porirua already, as well as the current policy. So we're not intending to go through that slide by slide unless you want to, but a couple of points before we get into it. So a few things about the policy review approach. Firstly, our communities have changed. As our cities grow, our policies often need to grow as well. This policy is a prime example of this. So the current policy and its themes reflects communities and settlers at a certain point in history. Examples include racehorses from the UK, places in Cornwall, and Scottish rivers, all parts of Porirua's history, but quite narrow in scope. These themes don't necessarily reflect the diverse and unique communities living in Porirua today, including our Pacific communities as well as migrant communities. In addition, Council has recently adopted Mangarawa and Ola Kamatanga. As part of those consultations, it was clear that communities were asking for a sense of belonging, a sense of place, and a reflection of their identities across the city. This is why, for this policy approach, we've taken a principles-based approach with some clear naming subjects, which hope to encourage people across our entire city to get involved in naming and help shape some of our decisions. Secondly, the current process is quite time-consuming and inefficient. You might recall a couple of months ago we came to you with some names from Ngāti Toa for the Kāinga Ora development. So because it wasn't on theme, we had to write a council report, take it to council, and that process in itself is quite time consuming. So it's time consuming for officers, it's not efficient. So part of this is ensuring that we have an operational guide internally to make decisions quickly, clear naming subjects and a criteria that can shape that. Lastly, we're proposing that we broaden the scope of the policy. So the current policy is just street naming, but actually best practice is to have a naming policy that covers buildings and reserves and parks. And an example of this, which has been challenging under the current policy, is when people say, there's this person who's really special to me in my life and I'd like a park or a bench named after them. The current policy makes it quite difficult for us to give good advice on when we should do that and when we shouldn't. So, if you are happy for us to go straight to a discussion on the principle, we can do that, or we can go through slide by slide. What would you?
I think we should
Okay.
go to the discussion.
Yeah.
This, because you've taken it as read, but yeah, we're interested in the discussion.
All right. So, this is our proposed guiding principle of the policy itself. So, happy to hear feedback on that.
Jeff,
First of all, ngā mihi kia kōrero, and thank you very much for bringing this up. My first question is actually covered on this slide here, which is to say that the new naming policy will remove the current themes and replace these with naming subjects, which will guide naming decisions. Now, can I just be clear, is that with regards to existing themes for suburbs, or is it for new developments? Can I just get clarity around that?
Sure. So at this stage is removing the current themes in the current policy. Is this one not working? Sorry. And is replacing those themes with naming subjects, which we've covered in the papers. The current themes are very specific to obviously suburbs, and that makes it very rigid and difficult to work within. So we would discuss with developers if there were particular themes that they were after, but at this stage it's just looking at removing those themes and replacing them.
I have a follow-up question. I guess there may very well be a circumstance, and I think that this will need to be considered as when you come back, around what is a streamlined process to assist officers if there is another circumstance where a street name has to be changed for reasons that it would breach what would become this operative policy in terms of insensitivity or what have you in that space. Has there been any work in trying to give some clarity around that part of the process?
The renaming process in the new policy will be relatively similar to the current process. We're just going to clarify exactly what that is in paper in the policy. So it would be, there has to be a good case for change. So the member of the public or whoever it is that's suggesting a rename would have to provide that evidence and that good case for change. It would then be discussed obviously with officers. We would then seek guidance from the CE and agree to either bring it to councillors for decision, or it could be declined depending on the reason for the suggested change.
Excellent. Appreciate that response. In terms of the themes that have been put forward, is there any benefit in perhaps council having either in the policy or as an appendix a subset of names that it can therefore draw to people's attention in the first instance? They don't necessarily have to be chosen, but it may provide guidance or clarity to the general public in terms of the implementation of this new themes approach.
The answer is yes. So the plan is, in terms of the operational process, we will develop, I'm hoping to develop a working group that will get together to suggest a list of pre-approved names that will be a representative of our community, and that name list will be on our website, available to developers. The developers could even suggest some names. We'll obviously figure that out, and that list will be there to guide council officers as well as the public.
Okay, one last question at this stage. In the documentation that asks, the officers are suggesting that we should look to have a far more robust than what would be required under our existing policies to engage with the public with regards to this proposed change, and a list of particular groups to consult with. Is there a reason why veterans or historians have not been incorporated into that list with regards to that specific part of history within Porirua?
No reason.
No
but
reason.
Great idea.
Okay. Happy to give suggestions on at least 2 names.
This wasn't giving people a chance to rename a street that they're existingly, that we're not putting that out, are we? So we're not saying this street can be renamed just because somebody wants to decide to for this naming policy. I know we changed a street name in the east, but we removed most of the houses, but that's
Only
not...
by exception. It's incredibly disruptive for residents.
Trying to change limbs, mortgages, houses, all those things are... I just wanted to double check that.
I mean,
because that wouldn't be at our cost.
We've been doing it at about the rate of about 1 a year or 2 every couple of years. I wouldn't be keen. I know Ngāti Toa is pretty keen on some name changes, but I've spoken to Helmut in the past. I said it's actually very difficult, and it's particularly difficult for residents. So we will only consider it by exception, because actually people then have to go and change everything for all of their bills, all of their... Sometimes your address is used as part of your identification for a whole range of things, including online stuff. So it's actually quite a hard process to do. So, and costly. And so, yes, we're not saying we wouldn't do it, but it's not that we're going to kind of open it up to the public and suddenly say we're going to change it, what would you like? Because people won't, they'll quickly rebel against that idea. And even the ones that we've done, which, the one that we did most recently in the east, a lot of houses had been demolished there, so there were few people were impacted in a real world sense. So, but we still got some complaints through that process about, familiarity, and, this is a point of reference that I've had all of my life, and it's going to be, so it's a hard thing to do. So we're not opening it up as a invitation to, gosh, we could change everything, or anything you like, because no, that's not the purpose of this. But there will be names that might change. The one I recall was Tutuera Place, that was named after a person. It was misnamed after a person. It's not an unreasonable request that we change those things. So yes, it will be possible, but it's not. It's going to be by exception, not by.
So would that cost fall back on us then if we change it? So we'll have to cover everybody's mortgage things to get everything.
No,
lawyers.
We don't cover personal costs, but we there will be costs. I mean, it comes with a cost when you change names. So.
Ross.
Sorry,
Ross first and then Izzy. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that was my concern about opening this up to wholesale changes of names because of all sorts of reasons that people can think about. And I just want to make sure, I hear what you say, Wendy. I just want to make sure that the criteria for changing existing names is pretty clear and relatively strict. Given that there will be times when they do need to be changed.
Yeah.
But recognising all the issues that we've got here. To me, this is I don't have any problems with this policy. Looking forward. Mm-hmm. And, I think it's sensible to reorient our policy now, given the time that's passed since it was first approved by council. So I just want to make sure that we're not opening ourselves up to wholesale changes, name changes.
Yeah. Just to clarify, at this present time, anyone can request us for a rename, but what we don't have is guidance around when we would accept that and when we wouldn't, and what sort of circumstances that would be. So this will actually help us if those rare occasions do come up that a name requires to be looked at, to be changed. It would also evaluate a case for change before it went anywhere, which would include cost, impact on residents, overall reason for the change. So it does need to be addressed on a case-by-case basis, because if it's a small street with only a few businesses, then that looks different for cost and impact. So it would provide a mechanism for us to give good advice on when we should consider it and when we shouldn't. And it would also require full community feedback on that change.
So to be clear, the CE gets the first look at that and decision, and then you get the second based on whether the CE believes it's worthy of your consideration. So all that the policy will present is showing that clearly, that there is a pathway, there is criteria, and there are clear steps to manage the expectations around that. But it does not invite a whole bunch of renaming requests.
Izzy?
Okay, so I'm just thinking around, because we've had requests from family members, groups of people, not necessarily for the renaming of a street, but for the renaming of, and I'll give you the example, it's Kura Street, and it was Henry Smith, whose family and Titahi Bay Athletics, who requested that name changed because of the impact that he had on athletics in Porirua, Titahi Bay. He was associated with that. So if they were to, when we implement this, if they were to then put that request through again, it would go through the channel of going to the CEO, who then would come to us. Is that?
And this is a
how-
rename, is that?
This is a rename of Kura
Right.
Street.
So,
No, not the street, the park. The park itself. Sorry, to clarify, because that is where he did his work. And
yes,
gave
and the
back to
park is
community.
actually a little bit more simple because it has less impact on people and financial impact on people.
Right,
So
okay.
yes, it would be a case for change.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, thank you.
Kathleen?
So just to clarify, the naming policy is more about new names rather than renaming. So the renaming side of the policy isn't necessarily changing. Is that what I've heard right?
It's all of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is going to change the policy on renaming a new an old street to another name.
Well, the policy covers it all, but what we're saying is that renaming will be by exception, which it is already. So it's not much of a change. It's a different process that we have arrived at, but although I don't think there is a prescribed process right now, so it's basically a clarification of how you would get to a renaming position around any street. At the moment, we just bring them all here into council.
It's bringing transparency into a process for renaming. We don't currently have a transparent process that people can look at and understand, and therefore have we're managing expectations.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, so that answers that. Thank you. So then up there where it says the new naming policy will remove the current themes and replace them with different guides. So this is mainly for new buildings, then new developments. So the current themes, is that what those Scottish rivers you were talking about? So those would no longer necessarily be an option for in Plymouton, the new development up there for those streets. Is that the gist of it?
So largely the current policy will replace the current themes for new streets, buildings, facilities, reserves and parks. But we will again still continue to work with developers on the suggested names that they put forward, if there were any. We will also provide a list of names for them to choose from to make it faster and more efficient as well. So it would be any names that are suggested by our public will have to meet our new naming subjects.
Thank you.
Mike?
Yeah, Why do we avoid living and recently deceased people's names for streets?
It's a sensitive topic. So it is a common practice across a lot of councils where we largely encourage no recently deceased due to potential risks that come with naming streets.
Like
whatever.
P Diddy, is it currently the musician P Diddy?
There's many,
so
many
if something like that
examples.
happens, someone's held in high regard, and then it emerges that they're not, and you do not want that to be a permanent reminder in your city.
That's why it shouldn't be a living person either.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, another question on from that. We talk about Porirua, a multicultural city and a thriving migrant and refugee city, and that's great. The Nang family have been in Porirua for 100 years now, and you wouldn't know that there were Asian people in Porirua when you look around the street names or park names. There is nothing around the city to reflect that, and I think that's a bit of a travesty, actually.
Jeff?
I would resonate with the views of Councillor Duncan with regards to that. It's precisely the reason why this policy needs to be brought into the future. I want to just go into a greater detail with regards to name changes, because I agree with Councillor Leggett's viewpoint, which is that any changes should be a stringent process to meet. Had officers considered the possibility that one of the ways of being able to assess the case is to look at whether that street, if it was named under the policy as it was implemented, would not be permitted because it would breach that component? Isn't that part of the reason why, to get that significant height, that is one of the criteria I would have thought that would be considered as part of a name change? Is that possible? Was that being considered?
It's a bit revisionist. So things are named at a certain point, and it does mark the history of the way Porirua was built, and you wouldn't want to remove all of that for sure. There are opportunities for renaming when things, like the demolition in the east and etc., that you kind of think this is kind of self-evident. This is a pretty straightforward thing to do, but not everything should be necessarily held to today's standard, because in 20 years there'll be a new standard, and I'm not sure that that's necessarily the way we would reassess it. It would be, is it offensive at some level? I do know from my time at Wellington City there are at least buildings there that are carrying names of people who you might no longer wish to necessarily be associated with. There's arguments sometimes for these things that are a bit more than we wouldn't do it today if we had our time again. It's really up to you councillors when you get to decide around the committee table whether that's what you want to do. But it may well be that quite a lot of our city would require renaming if you took that approach. But, we see it as a kind of bespoke consideration at a point in time, and there may be some, there's likely to be all sorts of reasons, isn't there, that people want a name change. But I don't necessarily just thinking imposing today's policy on it will necessarily be the test.
Perhaps I've articulated myself inadequately. Obviously, the policy will change over time as a city changes over time, and the people around this table will change from time to time as well. But the expectation of names also changes over time as well. I reflect a lot on Matahorua and Calliope. there was an offence with regards to that, and it had been acknowledged, and finally acknowledged after some time by the council. And yes, I'm not going to undersell that there is a confluence of factors that made that a very cost-effective measure. But it doesn't take anything away from the reasons of itself being a name that, if we had this new policy in place, would be considered offensive and would not be allowed to be a street in of its own right. And irrespective of whatever criteria we would assess that level of offence, we'd still have something like that in place. I love the phrasing that has been used by officers around streamlining that process. And I think it is a multiple leg test to determine whether you would change a street that isn't just about whether it would meet the expectations of today. But we cannot have rationale that says we can't be revisionist in moving forward with a new policy with regards to the potential of changing street names when this council has already demonstrated a need to revise a name because of some of the very issues that we are coming to this table to talk about right now. It does reek of hypocrisy.
Can I just clarify? I wasn't saying that. I was saying that if there is offence caused either to Ngāti Tō or to anybody else, frankly, that is a case for change that needs to be made, and it needs to be considered on the merits of the case. I don't think and sometimes we won't have in our policy a list of things that are offensive in themselves. We don't know what people are offended by, and we won't actually necessarily know all the history of all of our street names. It just won't be obvious to us. So people have to make the case, and then we will consider it, So I think that's a not unreasonable approach.
And to reflect personally on that response, we already have developed that capacity either as councillors in making that decision or officers in determining that. Let's just go back again to Porirua as an example that was live and real. It was an offensive name. It had been known to be offensive for some time. Eventually, an application was brought forward to the council to change it on the case that it was offensive. Council took action and changed the name of it.
But it took action because the street was knocked down.
And that is exactly what I'm saying with regards to any new policy in place. There still must be a process in place other than carte blanche. I'm saying that the point being that you need to have in the policy clear language, and I love the word again, streamlining, to give clarity and transparency to the community that if you're going to change a name, that you better make sure that it's got a good argument. And perhaps, as I say at the very start of my reflection about this, maybe one of those cases that meets that expectation is, hey, if we had our way again and we wanted to put the street name in there, would it meet our criteria? No. I would think they would equally be a reasonable thing to do.
So I think that's exactly what we're saying this process will do.
So, Councillor Hayward, I can assure you that when we bring the detail of the policy back to you, you will see the criteria and the pathway for managing and dealing with exactly the point you are raising. We didn't bring that detail because that's to come for your decision making, but we have it, and we have thought about that incredibly hard and for quite a long time, and we welcome your feedback and your input that we've got that right, but it is to deal with that exact issue, and we hope we've got the right balance of pathway to address it for the city.
Ross.
Oh, well, I think we've covered the discussion now. It was my and Wendy's point. My original point was about wholesale revision and the opportunity to do that. I mean, I think we're going to strike a balance that will allow us to take things and discuss them case by case and have the criteria being pretty clear. So it'll come to us and we can discuss it again.
Kylie.
Thank you. Possibly I'm not as passionate about street naming than others or dogs. But also, I think going forward as well, street names shouldn't define, our city's heritage or our city's people, right? And I'm a little bit, when you decide or we want to name after a particular person, there is a real grey area there. And I'm kind of inclined to agree with that. Because, then you go with, well, we've got all these people, but what about these people? And I just want to say we don't have a Patricia, Grace, Way, Lane, whatever, but lots of recent councillors that are no longer here. But anyway.
And some of them.
Sit down.
And that should go in Plymouth and Hongaweka, by the way.
That's all right.
But also, I think it is very important, like we've done with Tutuera Place, with the misspelt of their Māori names, and also going forward, it'd be actually good to replace some of those so that because we need to have the tohutors on those particular Māori names as well, because it is part of the language. So I'm quite passionate about seeing that. Thank you.
Excellent. Anyone else? Yeah, Jeff?
I'm looking forward to the session coming forward. I also just want to take a moment to thank those who did respond to my request asking for information about suggestions about what future names could be, and that officers have taken that on board and put it into what is the first step towards a more fulsome change. So thank you.
Thank you, ladies. I don't think there's any more questions. Great job.
Right. So are you, just to check,
Yes.
are you happy that we go out to the stakeholder groups just with the principles and the naming subjects to get some feedback and then bring you back a full policy?
I'll go around the room. Sorry, yes, Ross first.
I was just going to ask, with the names of the groups you're going to go out to, there's no ratepayers. Oh, sorry, ratepayers. You're talking about local groups, but a wider group of ratepayers. I think we access, groups of people that can give their views on particular subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. We can go as far and wide as we want. We were also thinking about a survey online to access a few more people. So absolutely.
To get us broader.
I think everybody's happy with that, aren't you?
Wonderful.
If you want, the two names I was going to suggest, two groups would just be the Porirua RSA and Alan Dodson and his work with Porirua War Stories.
Okay. Thank you.
Carly, did you have something there?
I'm okay as long as we have the tohutor put into that policy. Thank you.
Yep, that's easy. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, staff. We will end with our karakia. All right. Are you joining in, staff?
We're just going to do our
Karakia? Yeah.
Should I take it?
Thank you.
Okay. Kia ora, everybody. Here we go. Tori wha. Kia horo tamarino. Kia whakapapa paunamu te moana. E huarahi mā tātou e te rangi nei. Aroha atu. Aroha mai. Tātou ia tātou katoa. Hui e, tae ki e. Kia ora, everybody.